In this chapter, we're going to talk about GDP and unemployment. As we discussed in the previous chapter, GDP is defined by the value of what is produced. But in measuring GDP, we look at what is purchased. We need to do this because GDP is based on the value of what's produced, so you need to look, and that value of what's produced is determined by the price paid by the final consumer. So we can measure GDP by looking at what was purchased in a year plus what was left over in inventory. Take our backpack example. We produced backpacks, say in 2016. We sold many of them. All right, so the value based on the final consumer price would be the value of those backpacks based on the value the consumers paid for that good would be included in GDP. But we may have made some backpacks towards the end of GDP, say in December of GDP, that were not sold in that year. So we can easily figure out what was the value if we produced if we look at what was purchased, and that was what was left over, and what was left over in inventory, we value that at the price, the current price for the backpacks. Okay, so we can think of GDP as the sum of all purchases plus inventory. So with our backpack example, let's think about who purchases the goods that are produced in the United States, or our backpacks, because that's part of U.S. economic activity. So individuals, members of households, are going to buy our backpacks for recreational use. And then companies, as part of their investment expenditures. Now, when we think about investment, we don't mean a financial investment. We mean an investment along the lines of capital formation. A company may buy our backpacks as part of the equipment that they use in providing their service. Perhaps it's a surveying company that's going to buy our backpacks so that their workers can haul their surveying equipment out to roadless areas or more remote areas in the field. All right, so companies might buy some of our backpacks. Governments, particularly the federal government, the military, may buy backpacks for military uses. And then some of our backpacks that are produced in our classroom economy or in the U.S. economy are purchased by consumers, companies, or governments in other countries. So some of our backpacks are exported to those buyers in other countries. All right, so all the buyers are basically consumers, companies, governments, and those that we export. But when GDP is measured, all consumption, all spending is added up, even on spending on goods that we purchase that are produced in other countries or goods that are imported. All right, so to sum up GDP, all that was purchased by the value of what was purchased by all consumers in the U.S. and outside of the U.S., and then we subtract off whatever it is that we imported. So GDP quite literally equals the sum of C plus I plus G plus the difference between X and M. All right, now we look at some data here on actual GDP, and when we look at this information, we want to answer these questions. You know, are there any recessions? What's the biggest component? What's the most volatile component? So let's look at some information here that's collected by the Bureau of Economic Analysis. That's a part of the U.S. Department of Commerce. And this agency collects information and estimates economic activity each 3 months, each quarter of the year. It's annualized, and then for each year. And you can imagine this is quite a difficult task. It takes quite a bit of information gathering to estimate this. So I'm making this recording in February of 2016, and if you look at the table, the most recent data we have is for the fourth quarter, the last 3 months of 2016. So the first quarter GDP data for January probably won't be available until sometime maybe in late April. It'll be a preliminary estimate, and then it gets revised. So the GDP, what's important to know about GDP information is what we have is not necessarily current. The unemployment rate, the measure of consumer prices, that's information that's relatively easy to collect and report, and usually we get that information for the last month. GDP data is quite old. All right, so also the data that I have here is real gross domestic product. In chain dollars, that's the index used to adjust for inflation. So when we're looking at GDP over time, it's very important to look at real GDP. Over this same time period, nominal GDP, fourth quarter of 2016, is about $18 trillion. Okay. So we have real GDP here, and if we look from quarter to quarter, what can we say here? It looks like the economy grew in real terms from one quarter to the next, from 2014 through 2016. Now let's look at the components a little bit. We have personal consumption expenditures, that's C. That's what we mean by consumption expenditures, just formally defined as personal consumption expenditures. And we can see that the basic divisions are between goods and services. As members of households, we buy durable goods. Those are goods that last for a longer period of time. Non-durable goods, foods, gasoline, clothing would fall under that category. And then we also purchase all kinds of services, medical services, financial services, educational services. All right, so let's look at C as we move from 2014, 2016. Looks like C pretty much grew from one quarter to the next. If we look at quarter four, we have a $16.8 trillion economy. This is measured in billions of dollars, so 16,804 billion is 16.8 trillion. And we can obviously see here that consumption expenditures is the largest component at $11.6 trillion. All right, so what I did is something that you should do also, is to find out what percent is C of GDP. So just rounding off, I took 11.6 trillion divided by 16.8, and GDP is C is about 69% of GDP. All right, it's the largest component. It also tends to be a relatively stable component. Now let's look at our goods and services. What do we spend as consumers? What do we spend most of our money on? Obviously it's services. If we look down here, quarter four 2016, services were about 7.5 of the 11.6 total. All right, so what's important to remember here, we notice right off the bat, is that if you want to know what's happening to GDP, C is a very good indicator of it. If consumer spending is going up, it's very likely that gross domestic product is also going up. Let's look at the next category, gross private domestic investment. That's I from our previous page here. And this would be from our backpack company. Whenever our backpack company spends money on new equipment, or if it expands its facility, it's going to be included in this. So primarily, gross private domestic investment is spending related to capital formation. We can see that, right? Because what's included is structures and equipment. If we make our factory bigger, that's going to show up in I. If we buy more equipment to build backpacks, that's going to show up in I. Now, I, if we look at this, it varies, right? In here, it went down from 2.8 to 2.7. This is a more unstable, it's a relatively small component of GDP, but it's relatively unstable for two reasons. Companies don't make consistent improvements or consistent expenditures in their expansion plans. You know, if one quarter we buy more machinery, it's going to be a little while before we buy other machinery. We build a new factory one quarter, it's going to be quite a bit of time before we do it again. That's one reason that can result in that instability. Companies aren't like consumers where they buy goods they consume and wear out. We're looking at investable assets here. So that's one reason. The other reason is that gross private domestic investment depends on profit expectation. Again, with our backpack example, if we think demand is growing and we expect to sell more backpacks, to meet that demand, we're going to think that we're going to be able to produce more. We're going to have to invest. We're going to have to form more capital. So if we think profit expectations look good, if the economy looks strong, demand looks high, if we think we're going to make more profits in the future, then we're going to be more likely to invest in plant and equipment. On the other hand, if we think the things don't look good. We think, oh, the economy's not looking too good into the future. We think we've already reached the peak here. We think backpack demand's going to decline over time. That means we're going to cut back on our investment. So that component, it gives the economy, gives a capitalist economy its instability, because the capitalist, the company owner, is the one that's going to be making that investment decision. Now, investment spending, I, is about $2.9 trillion. We divide that by 16.8, and investment spending is about 17% of GDP. All right, a small component, but relatively volatile. And then let's look next. We have net exports of goods and services. So let's look at the line below for exports. In the fourth quarter of 2016, exports had a value about 2.1 trillion. That's purchases by consumers, companies, governments, and other countries for goods that are made in the United States. And then if we look at imports here, we've got imports that are about 2.7 million. That means that consumers, companies, buyers in the United States are buying more goods that were produced in other countries than those consumers, companies in other countries buy that are in the United States. So we have a X is going to be smaller than M. We have a balance of trade deficit. And what that deficit is about $600 billion. Okay? U.S. economy, we can see what drives it is C. Not so much an export-based economy. And then we have government at the end. So we've got our three components, C plus I plus X minus M, and here's G, federal, state, and local government, and that's about $2.9 trillion. So government spending is currently about the same as gross private domestic investment, I, and it's about 17%. So if we sum these all up, what we measured so far, consumer spending is about 69%, I is about 17, G is about 17. That adds up over 100%, and the excess of imports over exports subtracts off about 3% to get us down to 100. Okay. One last thing I want to add: C as a percent of GDP varies a little bit. A lot of times in the financial news they'll say that C is 2/3 of economic activity. That means that consumption spending is about 66% of GDP, but it varies a little bit. We're at 69% now. Recent past, it's been as high as 70%. All right. Now, let's look at some information from the recession in 2008. Okay, this was a relatively severe recession. As I mentioned before, we don't give all recessions names, but economists, if we have a particularly dramatic recession, it'll get a name, and this one was called the Great Recession. Not as bad as the Great Depression, but a Great Recession. Right? And when did this start? We have quarterly data, but officially this started in the end December of 2007, and we can see with the first quarter of 2008 we have a slight decrease in economic activity, a slight increase, and then we have moved into the severe contraction in the third and fourth quarter of 2008 and the first quarter of 2001. Now what's important to remember about this is the GDP. This is basically the percentage change in GDP from one quarter to the next. So in quarter 3 we have a 4% reduction in economic activity from the second quarter. Then in the fourth quarter we had over a 6% reduction in GDP from an already depressed level from quarter 3. This may look like an improvement in the first quarter of 2009, but what that means is the economy decreased by over 4% from its already low level from quarter 4. So this is a very serious and severe contraction in economic activity the economy didn't stop contracting until June of 2009, and here we have the third quarter where we have some economic signs of economic growth. Now, when the economy grows, that doesn't mean it's back to the level before the recession. It just means here that it grew a little less than 2% from that level. Severe contraction, severe reduction in economic activity. When the recession ends, it just means the economy is not shrinking anymore. It's starting to grow, but it's not growing as quickly. Now, as I mentioned in class, this recession was a financial recession. Started in the financial sector, and financial crises can be quite severe because they wipe out a lot of assets, a lot of confidence in the economy. And so typically it takes a long time to slowly grow out of that type of recession. So here we have severe contraction in economic activity. We do have a period of over 4% growth, but after that, growth's 3%, around 3% or less. And that's characteristic of a financial crisis. You dug yourself in a deep hole. That takes a long time to recover from that kind of recession. Now, let's talk a little bit about how to do a paper on GDP. In the previous chapter, we talked about how to do a paper on inflation. You might choose to do a paper on forecasting GDP. All right, why is this important? Because this is in the stock market in particular responds to any signs of economic activity. GDP is basically a measure of what corporations, companies, producers in the United States are producing. If GDP goes up, it means those companies, corporations are producing more. It implies their profitability is increasing. A growing economy implies higher corporate profits. If that's the case, whenever corporate profits go up, stock prices are going to go up. So you can see this in the financial news. Any sign of a growing economy, stock prices go up. Sign of a slowdown in economic activity, stocks go down. All right. So what we want to do is, this is a short-term forecast. There is a sample paper on Blackboard that's on inflation, but you want to follow the same format. The first thing you want to do is you want to construct your table of data. So the first thing we want is our GDP measured in percent change. Again, Bureau of Economic Analysis. Here we've just got the percent change in real GDP, and this is a short-term forecast. This is going to be quarterly data, so let's just look at the last 3 quarters. What we want to know is what's GDP going to be, in the next quarter, or maybe the next 6 months. So we can see GDP does not grow evenly from one period to the next. Oftentimes, the growth in GDP is referred to as a cycle. Here GDP went down, it grew a lot, it grew a little bit slower. So GDP it goes up and down kind of like a wave. The growth in it goes up and down like a wave. Sometimes it's going like this, sometimes it slows down a little bit. Sometimes the growth can be negative, but the point here is that it's like a cycle, it's like a wave. So here the economy is growing. We're in the expansionary phase of a business cycle. Back in 2008, we're in the contractionary or recession stage of the business cycle. But for the purposes of our illustration of how to do a paper on GDP, we just want to get it's a short-term forecast. The best indicator of the immediate future is the immediate past. So we got 1.4, 3.5, 1.9. Okay, that's the trend in GDP. We are going to look at some other information to get an idea what that forecast is going to be. Now, the U.S. Census Bureau releases information on monthly retail and food service sales. Why is this important? Well, we mentioned a minute ago, consumption spending, is about 69% of GDP. So C is a very good thing to watch if you want to know what's happening in GDP. So retail sales, that's released every month. And I've This is released in the middle of February, and it's data for the most recent data we have is for January. So down here on the graph, we've got November, December, January. You've got the percentage changes here. And what we're interested in is the black. The black is the total change in retail sales. All right. So retail sales is a measure of spending. And if spending is going up, we think C is going up, and we think GDP is going to go up, right? Just kind of simple causation. Now the thing is, retail and food service sales isn't a perfect measure of C, because what the big part of C is services. Retail food services doesn't capture that too well, but it's a pretty good indicator nonetheless because it's current, right? GDP information, we're not going to find out what GDP is for the first quarter of 2017 for many more months, but this can tell us something relatively quickly. So let's look at this. We have in December, retail sales grew by 1% from their previous level from November, and in January it's positive, but retail sales grew 0.4 more than in December. Okay, so these aren't really horrible. That's kind of a big number here, but these January and November, I don't know about you, but those look kind of low. It's positive, right? Spending is going up, but by a lot or a little? I agree with you. It looks like a little. So if we were to use this in forecasting, there's some variability. This has been seasonally adjusted, so it wipes out any irregularity due to the holiday season. But I would, it's positive, it's steady, it's consistently positive, it's low. So I would think that that would suggest that C is growing by a little bit, and if C grows by a little bit, since it's 69% of GDP probably is growing by a little bit. Right? Another good indicator of the economy that's reported every month is the change in payroll employment. Now this is reported from the Bureau of Labor Statistics, Department of Labor. The BLS collects information on unemployment and employment, two different surveys collect that information, and then inflation. Bureau of Labor Statistics is quite busy. Now here's the change in payroll employment from one month to the next. This is, you can't miss hearing this in the news because it's so widely reported, and it's reported every month. So here it is. It's usually about the first week of a month you get the information, the estimate of job growth for the previous month, right? And this is in thousands. So in January of 2017, payroll employment increased by 227,000. Now, these are all positive numbers. We go back to August, all positive numbers, okay? And quite simply, the relationship between employment and GDP is quite obvious. If you have more people working, they're producing more goods and services, and that means GDP is going up, right? Okay. Now, we want to put this number in perspective. Remember when we talked about capacity utilization, we had a rule of thumb that when capacity utilization gets above 85%, then maybe it triggers, it's a sign that you're going to have inflationary pressures. Well, with the employment, to kind of put that number in perspective, we want to look at it relative to overall population growth. The U.S. The population of the United States is over 300 million. As that population grows, people mature, they quit school, they're finished with school, and they need work. Given the size of the population, it takes about 150,000 jobs each month to absorb just kind of natural increases in the population. Okay, so in January, the economy created a number of jobs in excess of that. About 150,000 jobs would have been needed to just meet the needs of a growing population, and then the rest of that, we got about 77,000 jobs, would be available for work for people who are unemployed who are looking for work. Okay, so that's a pretty high number. If we look back at October 2016, Well, the economy created more jobs, but not enough to keep pace with inflation, let alone to help people who are out of work and looking for work find work. Okay? So this thing fluctuates a little bit. It's very important. During the economic crises in 2008, 2009, 2000, even into 2010, but during when the economy was, we have those blue bars just dipping down, showing contraction in economic activity. The economy was shedding 500,000 jobs a month or more. Okay, so we've had relatively slow recovery where we've had job growth, but it's been relatively low. We're not producing that much more. We don't need that many more workers. Okay, so this is a very important thing to watch. And what financial watchers of the economy look for is for this to kind of have several months of, say, 200,000 or more jobs created per month, because that would suggest the economy starting to get momentum. Momentum is a very important thing to think about with the economy, because think about this. If we had several months of 200,000 or more jobs created each month, that means more people are working, incomes are going up, and spending is going up. When people spend more, what happens? Companies are going to produce more. When companies produce more, what do they got to do? They got to hire more. Okay, so momentum is a very important thing to consider with an economy, and momentum works both ways. If you have growth, you tend to growth in employment, growth in economic activity, it tends to result in more growth in the future. Now, momentum can work the other way too. If there's a lot of layoffs and people are losing their jobs, employment goes down, incomes go down, people spend less. People spend less, companies produce less. When they produce less, they lay off more workers. Less income, less spending, less economic activity. So the economy can roll downhill. Momentum can push the economy downward, it can push it upward. All right? Now let's see. Okay, so there's our information. Now let's look back at this just for a moment. Here's our trend. When we collect data for our table, we have the last 3 quarters of GDP. We have the last 3 months. Sometimes the information doesn't all line up in terms of months and quarters of retail sales. When we looked at that, it suggested that we have an increase in sales, but not that much. The retail sales data suggested C was going up a little bit, GDP is going up a little bit. Okay, now we looked at the last 3 months here. This is very promising news, but you know, this is positive. We have more people working, more people are producing more goods and services. That means GDP is going up. But would you say this suggests that GDP is growing a lot or a little? I'd say probably a little. So the two pieces of information together, the information on retail sales, on employment, would suggest that GDP is growing kind of slowly. Okay? Now when you do your paper, a couple aspects of it. There are 3 aspects that you want to consider. First is, what do you want to do your paper on? You decide to do a paper on GDP. On Blackboard, there's a PowerPoint slide with these websites. You don't need to go prowling around looking for data. I've got it all always set up for you. Okay, you can use the data we have in class. All right, you make the table. You organize these data. All you need is we're a short-term forecast. Just go back to last 3 periods, 3 months for this and this, 3 quarters for that. Okay, then you organize that data. You need to use your macroeconomics to explain to me how these things are related, how employment and retail sales are related to this. When you write your paper, assume I don't know anything about it. You're going to explain it step by step to me. All right, when you do that, I can see that you have a complete understanding of it. It makes me happy. I'm thinking about putting 100% on that paper. Okay, that's what I want. Your forecast, you can forecast anything as long as your economics makes sense. Okay, then also think big. You're a famous economist. You've got a blog. You're an expert on the economy. When you announce something about economic activity, people listen to your forecast. People involved in financial market, particularly stocks, watch GDP. So if you say the economy is going to grow a little bit, this is the third part of the paper, how do financial markets respond? Well, if GDP is going to grow a little bit, it's growing, but a little. Stocks, probably, that's relatively good news for stocks. It's not outrageously good news, but stocks could continue to go up, but probably a little bit. Right? Now, last main macroeconomic topic, unemployment. Now, what unemployment is, how it's officially measured, is different than how we think about it intuitively. If we think someone's unemployed, I mean, they're not working, right? But the way that unemployment is defined is, and has to be defined this way because unemployment gets measured every month. We get unemployment information relatively quickly. To be able to measure it, we have to have a precise definition that has limits. So the unemployment is defined by a measure of the number of people who are actively looking for work. All right, now let's think about this. We just saw it, Bureau of Labor Statistics conducts a monthly survey to determine that amount. Okay, and about this, the first week of one, at the end of the first week of 1 month, we get information on what the unemployment rate was for the last month, and we get the information in a timely manner, but it's kind of limiting, okay, because of this definition, to be able to collect that information. So to illustrate the difference between how unemployment is officially measured and how we commonly think about it, let's just think about this. Suppose we have a classroom. Classroom's got 50 people. That's our population. All right? And say 25 people have jobs and 25 people don't. So we might think that relative to the whole class size, the population, 50% of the people are unemployed. All right? That might be a common way, is what percent of the population is unemployed, but that has absolutely no relation to how unemployment is officially measured. In that monthly survey of about 60,000 households, the Bureau of Labor Statistics call people up. They're going to ask the first question of the people who live in that household: how many people are in the age eligible population? That means you're over 16 or over, and you're not institutionalized. So if there's a 14-year-old that has a paper route, they got a job, but they're not included in any of the unemployment or statistics because they're not age eligible. A member of that household might be in a state or federal prison where they're working, making license plates, 25 cents. They've got a job, but they're institutionalized. So those groups would be excluded, all right? Then the next question has to do with who's in the labor force. So the BLS, they got to make 60,000 phone calls pretty dang quick. They don't have a lot of time to quibble. So they're going to ask who worked in the last week. Now, the standard unemployment rate is based on if you worked or not. So there might be some members of that household. Say there are 5 members of the household. You got a 14-year-old who has a paper route. They're not included. You have a family member who's regrettably in prison. They're not included in this survey. So you got 3 people left of the 5. One has an MBA, but cooks French fries at McDonald's. They're underemployed. They can't find a better job than that. Oh, they're included as being employed even though they are underemployed. They're working less than they want to, and they're working below their skill level. Okay? So we got, say, 2 people left that person would be employed. Another person has a full-time job. All right, so we got 2 people employed, and then we have 1 person who's not working. Okay, so that question is, what's that person's status? They're going to be counted as unemployed if they made some inquiry or have some if they had some inquiry about employment in the last 4 weeks. So if that person perhaps formally went to an interview or had an application, they would be classified as being unemployed. If the individual inquired, hey, asked a friend, are they are they hiring where you're working? If they're showing some interest in activity in pursuing a job, and they've done that in the last 4 weeks, then they're counted as unemployed. If they last looked for work actively 6 weeks ago, then they're not included in the unemployment rate. They would be considered out of the labor force. Okay? So going back to our classroom example, we have 50 people in there. We have 25 people that are employed, but let's say with this survey that we've done here, we find out that 5 of them are actively looking for work, and they've done that in the last 4 weeks. Okay? The other 20 people in the classroom aren't working. They would be out of labor force. If they're not actively looking for work in the last 4 weeks, you're out of the labor force. And that, a lot of students, they don't want to work during the semester. They're not interested in working. They're not looking for working. They're out of the labor force. So in our classroom, the unemployment rate would be the number of people unemployed, let's say that's 5, divided by the labor force. The labor force is the number of people employed, which is 25, plus the number of people unemployed, which is 5. So 5 divided by 30 is 16.7%. All right? So when we just casually measured the unemployment rate, it was about 50%, but when we officially measure it, it's going to be something much different than that, because we look at a different population, and then we also make a distinction about what it means to be employed or not, and we got 16.7%. Okay? Now the unemployment rate can do some pretty strange things, because the unemployment rate is going to depend on who's looking for work or not. So in a recession, just go back to that graph we had for 2008, 2009, 2010, when the economy contracted so severely, companies were laying off workers for a long period of time. If you lost your job early in that recession, you might go back and look for work, but no one's hiring. Everyone's reducing employment. So after a while, what are you going to do? You're going to stop looking because there's no jobs. When you actively look for work, you'd be counted as being employed. But then when you stop looking for work, you're going to become out of labor force. So in a recession, the unemployment rate can go up, but then when people stop looking for work, it can kind of just level off. Oddly, when the economy is growing, the unemployment rate, the economy is growing, jobs are being created, the unemployment rate can go up. How can that happen? That doesn't make any sense. Well, if someone has not shown an interest in working, or they were not able to find work, when the economy is growing, what are they going to start doing? Start looking for work. And when they start looking for work, they're entering the labor force. So the unemployment rate can do some things that are kind of unpredictable, or things that we wouldn't expect it to do, because of people moving in and out of the labor force. Now let's look at the current information for the unemployment rate. Here it is right here, our Bureau of Labor Statistics. And last January, it was 4.8%. If we look at the trend, it's been more or less declining a little bit over that period. Okay, so that means that 4.8% civilian labor force is actively looking for work. Okay, and that's relatively low. The recession, it was much higher than that. It's been kind of coming down with the recovery. Now the thing about that last recession is that it was so severe. For a long period of time, there were no jobs. People stopped looking. So the Bureau of Labor Statistics also has alternative measures of labor underutilization or unemployment. And let's look at U6 here. This is the total, it's the number of people officially unemployed, look for work in the last 4 weeks, plus those people who are marginally attached. Marginally attached means they're not working, nor are they looking. They've kind of given up. There were no jobs created for a long time. They just kind of stopped looking. But they want to work, and they're available for work. If we include them with those who are officially unemployed, plus those individuals who are work part-time out of economic reasons, that would be like in our survey, you have someone with an MBA that's cooking fries at McDonald's, right? They're underemployed. They would like to have more work. And if you look at that, then the unemployment rate last month was about 9.4%. That's the official rate. That's the unemployment rate when underemployment or when marginally attached individuals are included in that. All right. Why can people be unemployed? Several reasons. One is you can become structurally unemployed. That's because the structure of demand in the economy has changed, where the good is no longer in demand, so the labor used to produce that good is no longer in demand. Newspaper journalists in general, are structurally unemployed. People aren't reading newspapers. They're getting their news from other sources. They're not reading newspapers. Demand for newspapers is going down. Newspapers are not hiring as many journalists. Okay, so journalists can be unemployed because they don't have current job market skills. Their jobs are basically obsolete. Frictional unemployment has to do with friction as in normal activity, coming and going activity. Frictional unemployment has to do with someone, they finished their school. When they were in school, high school, maybe they weren't looking for work, but when they graduate, then they start looking for work. So they're entering the labor market because they're becoming of age to look for work, or they're through with their education. If you're in college and you're not looking for work, when you're through with college, you're going to start looking for work, and we would say you're frictionally unemployed. Some people quit their jobs to look for another one. That would fall into that category. Seasonal unemployment has to do with not having jobs because of the time of year. Agricultural workers, they're busy in the summer, spring, summer, fall. During the winter, there's not much demand for their services. They're seasonally unemployed. And then cyclically unemployed has to do with the business cycle. I mentioned a few minutes ago, the economy kind of moves like a wave. Sometimes it grows quickly, sometimes it grows a little slower, sometimes it contracts. And cyclical unemployment just means you are laid off because of the recession. Okay? Cyclical unemployment means laid off. All right? So we can think there'd be appropriate policy for each. To address fictional unemployment, you want to reduce the amount of time it takes for someone to find work. So you want to have lots of information about what kind of jobs are available. Pueblo has a one-stop job center. So if you're out of work, you can go there, and there's lots of information about job availability. If someone's structurally unemployed, it means their skills are obsolete. They need to have current labor market skills. They need to be retrained. And then cyclical unemployment, if you're laid off because of the recession, we think, well, the economy is going to recover. You're going to get your job back, but in the interim, we have unemployment insurance for people that have been laid off. Now, here's the fun part here. We would never expect the unemployment rate to be zero. Why not? We're always going to have frictional and structural unemployment. We would think that would be natural. There's always going to be people becoming of age, graduating from school. They're going to enter the labor market. You're always going to have that component. And then also the nature of the economy, what's in demand and what's not in demand, is going to change. There's always going to be some industries that are emerging that require new skills. There are going to be other industries that are in decline where those skills are no longer needed, they're obsolete. Okay? Now, the unemployment rate can tell us something about inflationary pressures, because it can tell us something about whether or not there's a skilled labor surplus or a skilled labor shortage. Let's think about this. And what we want to do is we think that natural rate, we want to compare the current unemployment rate to the natural rate, because we think frictional and structural unemployment is going to sum up to about 5%, 5.1% if we want to be precise. Okay, so let's say we have, say the current unemployment rate is 6.8%. It's not, but let's say it's 6.8%. We would say 5.1% of that is natural. That's because that's the structural and frictional unemployment component to it. So the difference between 6.8 and 5.1 is 1.7. Our unemployment rate seasonally adjusted, we don't need to worry about that. So what we're saying is that 1.7 is because of cyclical unemployment. It's because people have been laid off. Now, people that laid off, if we're producing backpacks in our classroom, there's a recession, we lay some people off, right? Okay. The unemployment rate is 6.8%. The economy starts to grow, starts to recover. If we needed to hire more people, would there be skilled workers available among those who are unemployed who we could hire? Yes. We laid some people off. We could hire them back. So when the unemployment rate is greater than 5.1, we say that there's a skilled labor surplus. There are people available that are not working, they're unemployed, but they have current job market skills. If our PAC demand starts to grow, we start to hire, we're going to bring those people back. If they're good workers, we're going to bring them back. Why? Because we can get them back to work for us at the same old wage rate. They'd be happy to come back at their same wage. We don't have to pay them more to get them to come back. And then they're trained, right? Come on back. Here's your old job. The employment costs associated with hiring that person, pretty low. Paying the same old wage, you got a productive worker. So when we have a skilled labor surplus, when the unemployment rate's greater than 5.1%, if the economy grows, companies can hire workers in general without having to pay real high wages. They get a productive worker. That suggests there's no cost pressure that's going to force the firm to raise prices. Isn't that fun? Now let's look at the current unemployment rate, 4.8%. That's less than 5.1. Now, what can we say? There's a skilled labor shortage. How the heck can we say that? The economy has grown. What is the cyclical unemployment rate? What is the layoffs? Everyone's been hired back, right? The only people left are those that are frictionally and structurally unemployed. What can we say about them? They don't have current job market skills. Someone's just finished school. They don't have any skills, job market skills. And then who else is out there? Journalists that have obsolete skills. We're producing PACs. The economy is growing. We want to produce more PACs. We need to have more workers. We could hire those people. But then what happens? Well, they're not trained. We got to pay them a wage. Are they going to be that productive? No. So we're paying someone who's not producing that much. That sounds like our costs are going to start going up. The other alternative is we could have our existing workers work time and a half, work an extra shift. What's wrong with that? Our labor costs go up a lot. But then instead of working 8 hours, we have people work maybe 12. When they work 12 hours, they start making mistakes. That suggests our labor costs are going up, our wage costs are going up, but our productivity is not rising that much. The other alternative is we can go to the other side of town where the other PAC producer is that's making Nike or JanSport. Those people know how to make PACs. We can entice them to come work for us by saying what? Come work for us, I'll pay you more. If I pay those workers more, what do I got to do with my existing workers? I got to pay them more. So when the unemployment rate is less than that natural rate of 5.1%, there aren't any readily available skilled people amongst the unemployed. What's left is unskilled. If we want to use skilled workers, we're going to have to entice them from another employer, or we're going to have to use our workers working more. It paints a whole different picture of we can start seeing our cost, our labor costs, our wage costs are going to start rising much faster than our productivity. And when that's the case, our costs start going up and our prices start going up. I think that's got it.